The sharp, metallic clang of a heavy tow hook striking a rusted steel bumper reverberated through the quiet courtyard of the financial district. Evelyn Carter stood on the pristine marble steps of the soaring glass tower, her posture rigid, her woolen coat buttoned tightly against the biting morning wind. She looked down at the old, faded pickup truck idling directly in the executive parking bay, a designated space clearly marked for the chief executive officer of Carter Equity. Her voice was flat, devoid of any hesitation or warmth as she spoke into her phone. Tow it now. Beside the truck stood Julian Brooks. He wore a heavy, fleece-lined work jacket, faded jeans dark with grease at the knees, and sturdy leather boots that had seen years of hard labor. Clinging tightly to his left hand was his 7-year-old daughter, Maya. She wore a bright pink backpack and a woolen hat that sat slightly askew on her head, her wide eyes darting between the massive tow truck backing into place and the elegant woman standing on the steps above them. Julian did not shout. He did not wave his arms or launch into a desperate explanation about why he had parked there. He simply looked up at Evelyn, his expression entirely unreadable. "Daddy, what are they doing to our truck?" Maya asked, her voice small and trembling as the heavy steel chains rattled against the chassis. "How are we going to get to school?" Julian squeezed her hand gently, his voice low and steady, acting as an absolute anchor in the middle of the chaotic sidewalk. "It is all right, sweetheart. We will walk. It is just a few blocks." Evelyn did not break her stride as she stepped past them, heading toward the heavy revolving glass doors of the tower. She caught the briefest glimpse of the little girl's tear-filled eyes, but she did not stop. In her world, rules were absolute, and weakness was an invitation to failure. Carter Equity was on the verge of finalizing a $2 billion joint venture with Halberd Holdings, the largest financial milestone in the company's history. Every second mattered. The presence of a battered, rusted truck in the executive bay was an eyesore, a distraction she refused to tolerate on the most important morning of her career. She stepped into the warm, climate-controlled lobby, the sound of the city fading instantly behind thick panes of reinforced glass, leaving Julian and his daughter behind on the cold pavement. As the tow truck lifted the front wheels of the old pickup into the air, Julian stood perfectly still on the curb. He didn't look at the small crowd of corporate employees who had stopped to watch the spectacle, some whispering, others snickering at the sight of a blue-collar worker being cleared out of the billionaire's way. Instead, Julian looked at the brushed steel letters spelling out Carter Equity across the face of the building. He memorized the name slowly, deliberate in his focus, before picking up a heavy, black equipment calibration case with his free hand. "Let us go, Maya," he murmured, turning his back on the tower. "We have a delivery to make across the street first." By 10 a.m., the atmosphere on the 37th floor of the glass tower was thick with tension. The massive walnut conference table was covered in leather-bound binders and legal addendums. The final signing with the Halberd Holdings delegation was scheduled for exactly 11 a.m., and Evelyn wanted every line of the text flawless. Sitting at the far end of the table was Richard Hale, the aging chairman of the board, who was methodically turning pages with a look of supreme confidence. To his right stood Margaret Shaw, the head of legal, a woman whose reputation for catching hidden liabilities was legendary in the American corporate landscape. But as Margaret reached page 142 of the primary joint venture agreement, her reading glasses slipped down her nose. She stopped. She flipped backward to page 86, then forward to page 93, then back to 142. The silence in the room stretched until it became heavy. Evelyn looked up from her tablet, her eyes narrowing. "Margaret, what is the delay?" "We have 45 minutes before the Halberd team arrives." Margaret did not answer immediately. She rubbed her temples, looking closely at a complex subclause buried deep within the capital adjustment section. "There is a structural linkage here that does not map correctly, Evelyn. The math looks clean, and the legal phrasing seems standard on the surface. But the way this specific clause triggers a debt-to-equity ratio test on page 86, combined with the governance rights detailed on page 93, it creates an organizational loop. I cannot trace the ultimate beneficiary if a technical default occurs." Richard Hale laughed softly, waving his hand dismissively. "Margaret, we have had 3 separate external audit firms look over this document for the last 6 weeks. It is a $2 billion expansion. Of course, the architecture is complex. We cannot delay the signing over a standard technical footnote. It is not standard," a quiet voice interrupted from the back row of seats against the wall. Every head in the boardroom turned. Daniel Reed, a 31-year-old junior analyst who rarely spoke during executive briefings, was standing up, His face was pale, but his hands were steady as he looked directly at Evelyn. I have seen this exact structural loop once before in my career, Daniel said, his voice echoing in the silent boardroom. 4 years ago, a massive public pension fund in Charlotte was 3 hours away from signing a nearly identical joint venture. The language was beautifully hidden. It looked like an ordinary safety mechanism. Evelyn leaned forward, her fingers interlocking on the surface of the walnut table. And what happened to that pension fund, Daniel? They signed it, Daniel replied quietly. And within 18 months, they lost their entire infrastructure portfolio to a hidden subsidiary. Only one man in the entire country caught the trap before it happened, and he wrote a 12-page warning memo that the board ignored. He left the industry entirely the following spring. Evelyn felt a sudden, cold weight drop into the pit of her stomach. What was his name? Daniel took a deep breath. His name was Julian Brooks. The silence that followed Daniel Reed's pronouncement was absolute, heavy enough to pressure the eardrums of everyone in the room. Evelyn Carter stood frozen at the head of the walnut table, her hand resting on the leather binder containing the $2 billion contract. The memory of the morning flashed violently behind her eyes. The heavy iron tow hook, the dull, scraping sound of steel against steel, the little girl in the pink backpack clutching the hand of a man who hadn't even bothered to raise his voice in protest. She had ordered his life disrupted without looking him in the eye, and now his name was the only thing standing between her company and total annihilation. Richard Hale broke the quiet, slamming his hand onto the table. This is preposterous. We are 40 minutes away from a historic signing, and we are letting a junior analyst spin ghost stories about a man who fixes broken machinery for a living? Evelyn, look at the markets. If we delay this signing, Halbert Holdings will walk, and our stock will take a massive hit before the opening bell tomorrow. Evelyn didn't look at Richard. She kept her eyes fixed on Daniel Reed. Where is he, Daniel? Where can I find Julian Brooks? I don't know his exact location, Miss Carter, Daniel stammered, shifting his weight nervously. He vanished from the corporate registry 4 years ago. No online profile, no consulting firm affiliation. The street rumor is that he takes independent diagnostic contracts for heavy industrial firms on the other side of the river. He operates entirely in cash or direct trade. He doesn't want to be found. Margaret Shaw closed her legal binder with a definitive, somber thud. If what Daniel says about the Charlotte Pension Fund is even partially true, we cannot sign this document today. I need time to cross-reference the subsidiary entities listed in the appendix. Evelyn, we need to delay. Evelyn took a slow, deep breath, restoring the absolute command that had made her feared across the financial sector. She pulled out her phone and dialed the corporate liaison downstairs. Postpone the signing by 3 hours. Tell the Halbert delegation that our legal team has flagged a minor compliance reporting detail. Be flawless, be brief, and buy me time. She didn't wait for Richard's outburst. Evelyn grabbed her trench coat from the back of her chair and walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. 10 minutes later, Evelyn was inside her corporate sedan, driven by her longtime personal chauffeur, Marcus Vance. Their first stop was the Metro South Impound Yard, a bleak, chain-link fenced lot situated beneath the shadow of the interstate overpass. Evelyn stepped out of the luxury vehicle, her designer boots stepping over puddles of oil-stained water as she approached the scratched plexiglass window of the security kiosk. A clerk named Gary Higgins looked up from a small television screen, his expression sour. "Can I help you, ma'am?" An old rusted pickup truck was towed from the Carter Equity Tower at approximately 7:45 this morning, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the ambient roar of the highway above. I need to know if the owner has collected it. Gary tapped at a grease-stained keyboard, squinting at the monitor. Yeah, a 2012 model. Owner came in about 40 minutes ago. Paid the full retrieval fee in cash and drove it out of here. Evelyn pressed closer to the glass. Did he leave an address on the release form? The clerk hesitated, looking at Evelyn's expensive coat and the black sedan idling behind her. Look, lady, corporate security or not, I can't just hand out. Evelyn slid a crisp $100 bill through the small slot at the bottom of the plexiglass window. I am not security. I am the woman who had it towed, and I need to correct a massive mistake. Gary looked at the bill, then quietly slid a carbon copy of the release receipt across the counter. The paper bore a bold signature at the bottom. Julian Brooks. Beneath it was a registered business address, 1402 Ironwood Lane, located deep within the industrial river bottom district. Marcus Vance drove the sedan across the iron bridge spanning the Gray River, leaving the clean, gleaming spires of the financial district behind. The landscape shifted into low-slung brick warehouses, corrugated steel workshops, and gravel parking lots crowded with delivery vehicles. The sedan pulled up outside a weathered brick building with a large, faded wooden sign mounted above the bay door that simply read, Brooks. Evelyn told Marcus to wait in the car. She walked up to the entrance alone. The massive overhead roll-up door was pulled halfway up, revealing a workshop that was unexpectedly spotless. Tools were arranged by size and metric classification along heavy magnetic racks. The air smelled strongly of clean machine oil, sawdust, and cold concrete. And there, parked directly over a drainage grate, was the rusted pickup truck. Julian Brooks was standing at a heavy oak workbench under a suspended industrial lamp, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing forearms lined with thick tendons and a faded scar running across his left wrist. He was carefully assembling a complex electrical component, his movements precise and entirely devoid of rush. In the corner of the workshop, sitting at a small wooden school desk, was Maya. She was quietly coloring a picture book, the pink backpack resting against the leg of her chair. Evelyn stepped over the threshold, her shadow falling across the concrete floor. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't drop his tool. He slowly placed the copper component down on a velvet cloth, picked up a rag to wipe the grease from his fingers, and turned around to face her. His deep, steady eyes met hers, holding a quiet masculinity that owed absolutely nothing to wealth or corporate status. "Miss Carter," Julian said, his voice a low, grounded baritone. "I believe my truck is legal here." Before Evelyn could speak, little Maya looked up from her coloring book, her wide eyes focused on Evelyn, recognition instantly flashing across her face. "Daddy," Maya whispered, her voice carrying a deep, heartbreaking innocence. "Is that the lady who took our truck away this morning? Did she come to take it again?" The sting of the little girl's innocent question cut through Evelyn's carefully cultivated armor. It was one thing to sign an administrative impound order from the safety of a climate-controlled executive tower. It was another entirely to stand in the cold reality of its consequences, looking into the eyes of a child who felt threatened by her presence. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, a sensation completely foreign to a woman who routinely dismantled entire corporate boards without breaking a sweat. Julian did not let the silence stretch. He walked away from the workbench, his heavy boots echoing softly on the concrete. The transition from a hard, capable technician to a profoundly gentle father was seamless. He knelt beside Maya's small wooden desk, entirely ignoring Evelyn for a brief moment as he placed a large, calloused hand over his daughter's small shoulder. "No, Bug," Julian said, his voice dropping into a warm, soothing register that instantly anchored the room. "Nobody is taking the truck, miss. Carter is just here to talk about some paperwork. Why don't you finish coloring that sky for me? You're doing a wonderful job staying inside the lines." Maya looked into her father's eyes, her small shoulders dropping as the tension melted away under the absolute security of his voice. She nodded quietly, picked up a blue crayon, and went back to her book. The profound trust the child placed in him struck a chord deep inside Evelyn. In her world, trust was a luxury traded for collateral, constantly measured and rarely genuine. Here in this cold warehouse, safety was provided effortlessly by a man who owned nothing but his tools and his integrity. Julian stood up, turning his full attention back to Evelyn. His physical presence was commanding, a quiet masculinity that made the spacious workshop feel suddenly intimate. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely unbothered by her status. "She is a little sensitive about the vehicle," Julian said quietly, his eyes holding Evelyn's gaze. "It belonged to her mother." Now, what brings the chief executive officer of Carter Equity to the east side on a Tuesday morning? I doubt you drove across the river to apologize to a 7-year-old. Evelyn swallowed her pride, reaching into her leather bag. She pulled out the heavy, bound draft of the joint venture agreement and placed it on the edge of his oak workbench. She didn't offer a corporate smile. She knew it would be useless here. 4 years ago, you wrote a 12-page memorandum regarding a public pension fund collapse in Charlotte, Evelyn said, her voice steady but urgent. A junior analyst on my team remembered your name. He told my board that the language buried in this contract matches the exact architecture of that specific failure. Julian looked down at the thick document. He didn't touch it immediately. A shadow passed over his features, a flicker of old memories from a life he had walked away from. The Charlotte deal wasn't a standard business failure, Miss Carter. It was a corporate execution. The board wouldn't listen to me because the projected profits looked too beautiful to be dangerous. They preferred the illusion of safety over the discomfort of the truth. They are walking into my building in less than 3 hours to sign this, Evelyn said, her controlled facade fracturing just enough for him to see the deep desperation underneath. The deal is worth $2 billion. My head of legal says there is a structural loop buried inside page 142 that she cannot untangle. I need your eyes, Mr. Brooks. Name your price. I will pay whatever consulting fee you require to map this out. Julian let out a short, humorless breath. He picked up a clean rag, wiping a stray drop of oil from the workbench. I don't want your money, Miss Carter. I left that industry because the money always comes with a requirement to look away. You didn't come here because you value my time. You came here because you are terrified you are about to lose your empire. I am terrified because I don't know the shape of the weapon, Evelyn corrected sharply, her natural competitive edge flaring before she quickly forced it back down. Please, just tell me what you see. Julian stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, reading the genuine vulnerability beneath her expensive exterior. The silence in the shop was heavy, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic scratching of Maya's crayon. Finally, Julian reached out and flipped the heavy contract open. He didn't start at the beginning. He didn't look at the financial projections or the executive summaries. His fingers moved directly to page 142, tracing the lines of text with terrifying efficiency. As his eyes scanned the legal clauses, his jaw tightened. He flipped forward to page 204, his eyes narrowing to slits as he read a tiny, italicized footnote buried beneath a list of cross-border subsidiaries. It is worse than Charlotte, Julian murmured, his voice deadly calm. Evelyn stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. What do you mean? Julian tapped a single line of text on page 204, looking up at her with an expression of grim certainty. This isn't a structural loop, Miss Carter. It is a hunting license. The people you are dealing with didn't build a partnership. They built an invisible timer. And the moment you put your signature on this page, the countdown to the destruction of your company begins. Julian tapped the tip of his finger against the footnote on page 204. It does not require your company to go bankrupt, Miss Carter. It is much simpler than that. This specific clause redefines the word default. In a standard American contract, a default means you failed to make a payment. In this document, a default occurs the exact moment your secondary logistics provider experiences an operational delay of more than 48 hours. Evelyn stared at the text, her vision blurring slightly as the sheer malice of the structure became clear. But our primary logistics provider is flawless. We never use the secondary provider unless there is an emergency. Which is exactly why they bought a controlling interest in your secondary provider 3 months ago, Julian said, his voice entirely flat, completely unbothered by the massive financial names printed on the page. They know your logistics schedule. They know you have a major equipment transition coming up next month. They are going to artificially delay that transition, trigger the 48-hour clause, and use this footnote to strip your voting rights before your board even realizes the clock has run out. It is a corporate execution disguised as an administrative oversight. Before Evelyn could process the staggering weight of the betrayal, the phone in her hand began to vibrate violently. The screen illuminated with the name of Richard Hale. She pressed the phone to her ear, her executive mask instantly sliding back into place, though her fingers gripped the device with a white-knuckled intensity. Richard, I told you I needed 3 hours. Evelyn, where the hell are you? Richard's voice exploded through the receiver, loud enough to echo off the concrete walls of the quiet workshop. The timeline just collapsed. Thomas Ward didn't go back to his hotel. He found out you left the building, and he just called an emergency meeting of our major institutional investors at the Sovereign Hotel's Sapphire Lounge. He is live streaming a statement right now, claiming that Carter Equity is negotiating in bad faith and stalling a historic merger due to internal leadership instability. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. Our stock, Richard. What is happening to the stock? It is cratering, Richard slammed out, his voice thick with unadulterated panic. We are down 4% in pre-market trading, and the board is absolute chaos. Thomas Ward told the investors that if the contract isn't signed in 20 minutes, Halbert Holdings is pulling out completely and launching a hostile takeover bid by noon. The board members are panicking, Evelyn. They are calling for an emergency vote to strip your executive authority and sign the deal without you. You need to get to the Sovereign Hotel right now with those signed documents, or you won't have a company left to manage by lunch. The line went dead. Evelyn slowly lowered the phone. The absolute control she had maintained for 14 years vanished in a single breath. The room seemed to tilt. Her breathing became shallow, rapid, her chest tightening until she felt like she was suffocating. She looked down at the $2 billion contract on the workbench, then at her trembling hands. For the first time in her life, wealth could not protect her. Power could not buy her a way out of the trap. She was completely, utterly helpless. Maya looked up from her coloring book, her young face twisting with sudden worry as she saw the elegant lady's eyes fill with tears. The little girl slid off her chair, walked over to Evelyn, and gently pressed her small hand against Evelyn's coat. "Don't cry, lady," Maya whispered softly, her innocent eyes shining with pure empathy. "My daddy is really smart. He fixes all the broken things. He can fix your paperwork too." The profound sweetness of the child broke through Evelyn's panic, causing a tear to escape and run down her cheek. She looked up at Julian, her sophisticated exterior completely shattered. She was no longer a feared CEO. She was a desperate human being looking for safety in a storm. "Please," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't face them alone. They think I am paranoid. They think I am destroying the company out of pride. If I go there without proof, they will take everything I have built. I need you to come with me, Julian. I need you to tell them what you found." Julian looked at her, his eyes assessing the raw honesty of her vulnerability. He looked down at Maya, who was looking up at him with absolute faith that her father could heal any wound. He had spent 4 years hiding from the toxic corporate elite, avoiding the very men who were currently sitting in the Sovereign Hotel. But as he looked at Evelyn's trembling hands, his quiet masculinity took over. He was a protector by nature, and he refused to let a pack of wolves tear down a woman who had the courage to show up herself. Julian picked up his heavy equipment case with one hand and reached down to take Maya's hand with the other. He didn't change his grease-stained work jacket. He didn't wipe the dust from his boots. "Let us go, Marcus," Julian said calmly, his steady voice instantly restoring order to the room. "We have a meeting to attend." 10 minutes later, the black corporate sedan screeched to a halt outside the gilded white marble entrance of the Sovereign Hotel. The valet drivers stared in utter disbelief as the doors opened. Evelyn Carter stepped out, her face pale but determined, followed closely by a man in a faded blue-collar work jacket and a little girl carrying a bright pink backpack. They walked through the opulent lobby, past crystal chandeliers and towering water features, heading straight for the double mahogany doors of the Sapphire Lounge. The sound of dozens of raised voices, camera shutters, and clinking champagne glasses leaked through the wood. Evelyn pushed the doors open, stepping into the luxurious room. The entire Carter Equity Board of Directors, along with 50 of the city's wealthiest institutional investors, were gathered around a raised podium where Thomas Ward stood, a sleek microphone in his hand and a victorious smile on his face. The room fell instantly silent as Evelyn entered. Every head turned, but the attention didn't stay on her. 50 pairs of eyes, dripping with wealth and corporate judgment, dropped to the dirty work boots and grease-stained jacket of the man standing directly beside her. Thomas Ward lowered his microphone, his smile twisting into a cruel, mocking sneer that reverberated through the elite crowd. "Evelyn," he projected loudly, his voice dripping with condescension. "We knew you were under pressure, but I didn't realize Carter Equity was resorting to hiring roadside mechanics to manage a $2 billion negotiation. Who is the grease monkey, Evelyn? Did your car break down on the way to your own execution?" The cruel mockery in Thomas Ward's voice rippled across the opulent, crystal-lit expanse of the Sapphire Lounge. A wave of low, polite snickers circulated among the rows of sharply dressed institutional investors. Richard Hale, his face a deep crimson of pure rage, stormed forward from the front row, his leather shoes practically burning through the plush velvet carpet. He looked at Evelyn, then at Julian, his hands shaking so violently he had to thrust them into his pockets. "Evelyn, have you completely lost your mind?" Richard hissed, his voice a lethal whisper that barely carried past the first few rows. "The trading floor opened 10 minutes ago. Our stock is in a free fall, down nearly 6% because Thomas announced we are stalling. And you walk into the most critical investor briefing of the decade with a mechanic and a child? Security. Remove these people immediately." 2 burly hotel security guards in tailored black suits stepped forward from the shadows of the mahogany columns. The taller guard, whose brass name tag read Arthur Pendleton, reached out a hand, intending to grasp Julian's shoulder and forcefully guide him toward the exit. Before the guard's fingers could make contact, Julian shifted his weight by a fraction of an inch. It was an incredibly subtle, fluid movement, but it possessed the unmistakable precision of a man trained in elite high-pressure tactics. Julian didn't strike the guard. He simply turned his torso, placing his large frame squarely between the security team and little Maya. His eyes locked onto Arthur's. There was no anger in Julian's gaze, only a deep, glacial stillness that caused the seasoned security guard to freeze mid-stride, his hand hovering uselessly in the air. "I would advise you to take a step back," Julian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, grounded authority that resonated clearly through the microphone Thomas Ward was still holding. Maya shrank against her father's leg, her tiny hands bunching the heavy fabric of his work jeans. The aggressive posture of the wealthy crowd, the flashing cameras from the financial journalists in the back, and the harsh, demanding voices were too much for the 7-year-old. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking as a tear spilled over her lashes. "It is too loud in here. I want to go back to the workshop." The entire room of billionaires and power brokers watched as the rugged man in the grease-stained jacket instantly dropped to one knee. In the middle of a $2 billion corporate war, with fortunes hanging in the balance, Julian Brooks completely detached himself from the chaos. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping Maya's face, wiping the tear away with his thumb. "Look at me, Bug," Julian murmured, his deep voice acting as a perfect shield against the hostility of the room. "Just look right here at Daddy. I need you to do me a favor. Take your headphones out of your backpack, put them on, and finish coloring that picture. Can you do that for me? The noise in this room doesn't belong to us. It can't hurt you." Maya looked into his calm, unyielding eyes, finding the absolute safety she had known her entire life. She nodded softly, reached into her pink backpack, and pulled out her bright green noise-canceling headphones. As she slipped them over her ears and sat down on a nearby plush ottoman, completely tuned out from the corporate battlefield, a heavy silence descended upon the lounge. Evelyn stood watching the interaction, her chest aching with a rare, profound envy. She had spent her entire life believing that money bought security, that contracts built walls, and that power kept you safe. Yet, in this room full of men worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the only real safety belonged to a little girl whose father didn't have a dime to his name in the corporate registry. Thomas Ward broke the spell, tapping the microphone impatiently. "This is a touching display of domestic poetry, Evelyn. But the clock is ticking. You have exactly 12 minutes before Halbert Holdings officially withdraws its offer and executes the automated margin calls with our primary banking partners. If you don't sign the document on the podium right now, Carter Equity will be picked apart by the vultures before the closing bell." Evelyn stepped forward, her sophisticated exterior returning, though her voice trembled slightly. "We are not signing the document, Thomas, because page 142 is a trap, and page 204 is the execution clause. You didn't build a joint venture. You built a mechanism to seize our entire logistics network within 18 months through a forced technical default." A murmur of shock erupted from the investors. Richard Hale gasped, looking between Evelyn and Thomas. Thomas didn't blink. He simply let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "A trap? Evelyn, you are letting your paranoia destroy your shareholders' value. Who gave you this ridiculous legal theory? Was it your head of legal, Margaret, who already approved the draft? Or did your brilliant new advisor here decipher it while changing your oil?" He pointed a mocking finger directly at Julian, who was slowly rising back to his full height. From the second row of the investor gallery, an older man with silver hair and a deeply lined face stood up. His name was Harrison Cross, the managing partner of the city's largest sovereign wealth fund. Harrison wasn't looking at Evelyn, and he wasn't looking at Thomas. He was staring intently at the faded, heavy equipment calibration case Julian had placed on the glass table. More specifically, his eyes were locked onto a tiny, scratched titanium emblem riveted near the handle, an emblem of a stylized falcon wing that only a select few individuals in the global aviation defense sector would ever recognize. Harrison's breath hitched. He stepped out into the aisle, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and profound reverence. "Hold on a minute," Harrison said, his voice cutting through Thomas Ward's laughter. "Thomas, shut up for a second." Thomas frowned, his arrogance faltering slightly. "Harrison, what are you doing?" "We need to force the vote." Harrison completely ignored Thomas. He walked directly toward the podium, his eyes never leaving Julian's face. He stopped exactly 5 feet away, his wealthy posture melting into something resembling pure humility. "It can't be," Harrison whispered, looking at the faded scar on Julian's left wrist. "You're the lead design architect of the Aegis propulsion systems. You're the chief strategist who overhauled the entire automated logistics grid for the United States Air Force C-17 Globemaster fleet after the crisis in 2012. You're Julian Brooks." The entire room went entirely, terrifyingly still. The name seemed to carry an invisible physical weight that shattered the arrogance of every billionaire in the room. Thomas Ward's face went completely pale, the microphone in his hand slipping slightly. "What did you just say, Harrison? Who is this man?" Harrison Cross took a step closer to Julian, his hands trembling slightly as he addressed the stunned audience of investors. He turned his head toward Thomas Ward, his voice rising with an intense, undeniable gravity. "Thomas, you are standing there mocking a man whose design blueprints are literally embedded in the guidance systems of every commercial aircraft your logistics firm owns. 14 years ago, when the entire Department of Defense automated transit network crashed during the Atlantic logistics blackout, the federal government didn't call an investment bank. They didn't call a corporate law firm. They called Julian Brooks. He wrote the foundational code that stabilized the entire American military transportation network in less than 48 hours. He is not a grease monkey. He is the master architect of the very infrastructure you are trying to steal." A collective gasp rippled through the Sapphire Lounge. The billionaires who had been snickering moments ago suddenly looked as if the floor had dropped out from beneath their feet. Richard Hale stumbled backward into his chair, his jaw hanging slack as he stared at Julian. Evelyn Carter stood completely frozen, her heart thumping wildly against her ribs. She had known Julian was sharp. She had known he caught a trap her entire legal team missed, but she had never imagined that the quiet man in the faded work jacket was an absolute legend in the defense and aviation industry. Thomas Ward gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning white as he fought to maintain his crumbling composure. His face had shifted from an arrogant sneer to a desperate, pale mask. "This is absurd," Thomas shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly as panic began to bleed through his polished veneer. "Harrison, you are talking about ancient history. Even if this man once wore a uniform or drew a blueprint, look at him now. He runs a failing repair shop on the east side of the river. He hasn't touched a high-level corporate contract in 4 years. He is a ghost. We are dealing with modern international finance, not military logistics. He doesn't have the standing, the data, or the authority to disrupt a $2 billion transaction." Julian Brooks slowly stepped past Evelyn, his large frame commanding the entire room without him even trying. He didn't rush. His heavy boots pressed into the plush carpet, the dull thud of his footsteps sounding like a steady countdown to Thomas Ward's ruin. He reached the edge of the glass table where his faded equipment case sat, and with a smooth, deliberate motion, he popped the heavy steel latches. The sound of the latches clicking open echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Julian didn't pull out tools. Instead, he pulled out a sleek, military-grade, rugged tablet. He tapped the screen twice, and suddenly, the massive projection screens behind the podium, which had been displaying the plummeting stock price of Carter Equity, flickered. The financial graphs vanished, replaced instantly by a complex, interlocking network diagram of corporate entities, supply chains, and hidden secondary logistics providers. "I don't need corporate standing to recognize a thief, mister," Ward Julian said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that filled every square inch of the lounge without the aid of a microphone. "You told this room that the joint venture contract was written by an independent legal counsel in New York. But the digital fingerprint on the metadata of page 142 belongs to a proprietary software architecture called Vanguard 9. It is a highly specialized algorithmic modeling system developed by the United States military to simulate blockades and supply line strangulation." Julian pointed a calloused finger toward the projection screen, where a bright red line began to trace a path through the various corporate shells. "You took a system designed to protect American forces during wartime, and you modified it to execute an artificial bottleneck on Carter Equity's secondary shipping routes. Next month, when Carter Equity initiates their seasonal equipment upgrade, your shell company, which secretly acquired the secondary provider 90 days ago, will implement a deliberate 48-hour operational delay. That delay will instantly trigger the technical default clause hidden on page 204. The room went entirely, single-mindedly silent as the investors stared at the red lines on the screen. The trap was no longer an abstract legal theory. It was a visible, undeniable reality laid bare by the man who understood the architecture better than anyone alive. Julian turned his cold, steady gaze directly onto Thomas Ward. When that default trips, the voting rights of this entire board are automatically suspended and transferred to an offshore holding company called Meridian Global. And who owns the controlling shares of Meridian Global, Mr. Ward? Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps as sweat began to bead along his hairline. Julian tapped his tablet one final time. The screen flashed, displaying a certified registry document from a private banking jurisdiction. At the very bottom of the document, listed as the primary beneficial owner of Meridian Global, was the full legal name of Thomas Ward. "You didn't come here to sign a partnership," Julian said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet finality. "You came here to steal a $2 billion platform for pennies on the dollar, using an infrastructure trap that you thought nobody in this city was smart enough to see. But you made one critical mistake. You left your trash in the wrong parking bay this morning." The power reversal was absolute and instantaneous. Harrison Cross stood up, his face dark with a lethal corporate fury as he looked at the sweating negotiator on the stage. "This briefing is over," Harrison roared, turning to the other institutional investors. "Sell every single share of Halberd Holdings data assets immediately. Pull our capital from their commercial funds before the morning trade logs close. Thomas Ward is finished in this city." The lounge erupted into absolute chaos. Investors screamed into their cell phones, ordering their brokers to dump Halberd stock. Financial journalists rushed toward the back exit to file the breaking story. Thomas Ward slumped against the podium, completely destroyed, his microphone dropping to the floor with a loud, piercing screech of feedback. Through it all, Julian calmly closed his equipment case, snapped the latches shut, and looked down at little Maya, who was still peacefully coloring her book behind her green headphones, entirely untouched by the storm that had just leveled a billionaire. Thomas Ward slunk out of the Sapphire Lounge like a beaten animal, flanked by hotel security guards who no longer looked at him with an ounce of respect. The room behind him remained a chaotic symphony of shouting investors, frantic phone calls, and the rapid clicking of journalists' keyboards. The $2 billion deal was dead, but Carter Equity was more alive than it had ever been. Richard Hale approached Evelyn and Julian, his posture completely broken, his previous corporate arrogance replaced by a desperate, sweating humility. He kept wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief, his eyes darting toward Julian with a mixture of terror and profound reverence. "Evelyn, I don't know what to say," Richard stammered, his voice shaking. "The board, we owe you everything. If it weren't for this intervention, Carter Equity would have been liquidated by the weekend. We were blind." He turned slowly toward Julian, extending a trembling hand. "Mr. Brooks, please accept my humblest apologies. The things I said, the disrespect this morning, it was unpardonable. If there is any position within this company, any executive retainer, any sum of money you require." Julian didn't look at Richard's outstretched hand. He simply hoisted his heavy equipment case, his movements slow, deliberate, and completely unbothered by the desperate wealth groveling before him. "I told Miss Carter before I stepped foot in this building, Mr. Hale," Julian said, his low baritone cutting through Richard's frantic energy. "I am not interested in your retainer. I didn't do this for your board of directors, and I didn't do it for your stock price. I did it because I despise a rigged system, and I don't like watching a pack of wolves corner a woman who has the courage to stand her ground." Evelyn watched Richard Hale, a man who had dominated her professional landscape for over a decade, shrink into complete insignificance in front of Julian. The grand illusion of the corporate elite had shattered completely, leaving behind a crystal-clear view of what real, unyielding strength looked like. It wasn't found in a tailored suit or a corner office. It was found in the quiet masculinity of a man who knew exactly who he was and required no external validation to prove it. Julian turned away from the stuttering chairman and tapped Maya gently on the shoulder. The little girl pulled off her bright green noise-canceling headphones, blinking as she looked around the room. The hostile atmosphere had completely vanished. The remaining investors were staring at her father with absolute awe, whispering his name like a legendary ghost that had suddenly materialized to save them all. "Is it time to go back to the shop, Daddy?" Maya asked, her small voice carrying a beautiful innocence that completely melted the remaining tension in the room. "Yes, Bug," Julian smiled, his entire face softening into a warm, protective expression that belonged exclusively to his daughter. We are completely done here. Evelyn walked beside them as they exited the luxurious lounge, leaving the frantic noise of the billionaires behind. As they stepped out of the Sovereign Hotel and into the crisp, thin autumn sunlight, the contrast between their worlds became strikingly vivid. The city hummed around them, but around Julian there was a pocket of perfect, grounded stillness. Marcus Vance, Evelyn's chauffeur, was already waiting by the open door of the black luxury sedan. He stood at absolute attention, looking at Julian with an immense, unspoken respect. He had seen the blue-collar worker ordered away like trash a few hours ago, and now he was watching him walk out of the building as the undisputed savior of the empire. Julian stopped on the wide marble steps, turning his steady eyes toward Evelyn. She stood before him, the cold, impenetrable CEO mask completely gone. Her hands were tucked deeply into her coat pockets to hide the slight tremor that still lingered from her near collapse. "Julian," Evelyn said softly, using his first name for the very first time. She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "I don't even know how to begin to thank you. You didn't just save my company today, you saved 14 years of my life. Everything I built, everything I am." It was resting on that signature. Julian looked down at her, his gaze holding a quiet, intense warmth that sent an unfamiliar flutter straight to her chest. "You built a powerful platform, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping into a private, intimate register. "But you were moving so fast you forgot to look at the ground beneath your feet. Speed without attention is just a fast track to a disaster. You don't owe me an apology, and you don't owe me a fee. Just change the way you move through people tomorrow. That is the only payment that matters to me." Before Evelyn could respond, little Maya reached out and gently grabbed Evelyn's hand. The child's small, warm fingers wrapped around Evelyn's manicured hand with a pure, unforced affection that Evelyn hadn't experienced in years. "Are you coming back to the workshop with us, Evelyn?" Maya asked, looking up with wide, hopeful eyes. "Daddy makes really good grilled cheese sandwiches on the little cast-iron stove when we finish a big job. You can have half of mine." Evelyn felt a sudden, profound tightness in her throat, a wave of genuine emotion washing over her. She looked from Maya's sweet, expectant face up to Julian. A faint, incredibly handsome smile played at the corners of his mouth, his deep eyes observing her reaction with a quiet curiosity. For a woman who had access to the most exclusive restaurants in the country, the offer of a split grilled cheese sandwich in a cold warehouse felt like the most luxurious invitation she had ever received. "I would like that very much, Maya," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking slightly with an emotion she didn't try to hide. "But I have to clean up a few things in my tower first. Can I come by this Saturday instead?" Maya looked up at her father for permission. Julian nodded once, his eyes locking onto Evelyn's with a deliberate, lingering intensity that promised something far deeper than a standard business acquaintance. "Saturday works just fine, miss." "Carter," Julian murmured. "We will keep a seat open for you." He squeezed Maya's hand gently, and together the single father and his daughter turned, walking down the marble steps and disappearing into the bustling morning crowd of the city. Evelyn stood on the steps for a long, silent moment, watching the faded fabric of his work jacket until it vanished from view. She took a deep breath of the cold air, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over her for the first time in 14 years. She turned toward her waiting vehicle, ready to return to her tower and execute the final, definitive reckoning that her board desperately needed. But as she stepped into the car, she knew that the corporate world would never hold the same power over her again. The real master of the architecture had just walked away, and she couldn't wait for Saturday to arrive. The 4 days that followed the showdown at the Sovereign Hotel were a whirlwind of absolute institutional restructuring. Evelyn Carter did not waste a single second. By Wednesday morning, the board of directors had voted unanimously to terminate the consulting contract of Richard Hale, stripping him of his remaining oversight capabilities and forcing him into an early, unceremonious retirement. Daniel Reed was moved out of the back row of the analyst floor and officially appointed as the new head of risk management. His salary tripled and his authority made absolute. The markets had responded to the news with a massive, unprecedented surge. Carter Equities stock didn't just recover, it skyrocketed by 9% as Wall Street rallied behind a company that had successfully exposed an international corporate espionage ring. By Friday evening, federal authorities had launched a formal investigation into Halberd Holdings, using the encrypted metadata Julian Brooks had projected onto the lounge screens to freeze Thomas Ward's offshore assets. The trap had backfired so spectacularly that the entire financial sector was still shaking from the aftershocks. Yet, as Saturday morning arrived with a brilliant, crisp blue sky, Evelyn didn't feel the familiar, competitive rush of corporate victory. Instead, she felt a profound, quiet anticipation. She drove her own vehicle, a modest, unpretentious SUV she hadn't driven herself in nearly 3 years, and parked it 3 blocks away from the river bottom district. She wanted to walk. She wanted to feel the cool autumn air against her face without the insulation of tinted, bulletproof glass. She had traded her tailored corporate armor for a soft, cream-colored knit sweater, dark denim jeans, and comfortable leather boots. For the first time in 14 years, her hair fell loose over her shoulders, entirely free of the severe, unyielding bun she usually wore. She walked up to the brick warehouse at 1402 Ironwood Lane. The massive overhead roll-up door was fully raised today, allowing the pale, warm sunlight to flood across the clean concrete floor. The familiar scent of machine oil and cold stone was accompanied by a rich, deeply comforting aroma, the unmistakable smell of toasted buttered bread and sharp cheddar cheese. Maya saw her first. The little girl sprang up from her wooden desk, her pink backpack nowhere to be seen, replaced instead by a small canvas apron that sat slightly crooked on her waist. "Evelyn!" Maya cried out, her face lighting up with a pure, radiant joy as she ran toward the entrance. "You actually came! You're right on time!" Evelyn knelt down as the little girl approached, instinctively opening her arms. Maya didn't hesitate. She crashed into Evelyn with a warm, trusting hug that completely melted the last remaining remnants of the cold corporate world that had bound Evelyn for over a decade. "I promised I would be here, didn't I?" Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with a genuine warmth she didn't know she possessed. "I never break my promises." Julian turned around from the heavy oak workbench. He was wearing a simple, dark gray thermal shirt that accentuated his broad shoulders, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows. In his large, calloused hand, he held a vintage cast-iron skillet over a small, impeccably clean camping stove set up on the corner of his bench. When his deep, steady eyes met hers, a genuine, incredibly handsome smile broke across his rugged features. "You're just in time, miss." "Carter," Julian said, his low baritone washing over her like a comforting anchor. "The cheese is perfectly melted. If you had been 2 minutes later, Maya would have eaten your half." "I had to drive myself across the bridge," Evelyn said, standing up and smoothing her jeans, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet, undeniable chemistry. "It turns out navigating the city without a chauffeur forces you to actually pay attention to the signs." Julian pulled up 2 clean wooden stools beside the workbench, setting down a pair of perfectly golden, sizzling grilled cheese sandwiches on simple paper plates. Maya immediately clambered onto her stool, swinging her legs with excitement as she took a large, happy bite. Evelyn sat down beside Julian, the physical proximity of his large, grounded frame sending a subtle, pleasant thrill through her chest. They ate in a comfortable, easy silence that required no corporate posturing, no strategic negotiation, and no hidden agendas. "Halbert Holdings filed for emergency restructuring this morning," Evelyn said quietly, breaking the silence as she looked at him. "The Federal Trade Commission is using your Vanguard 9 metadata tracking to review all of their previous acquisitions. Thomas Ward is facing 10 years for corporate fraud." Julian took a slow sip of black coffee from a tin mug, his expression entirely unbothered by the destruction of the billionaire. "The system eventually corrects itself, Evelyn," he said softly, his eyes searching her face. "Especially when the person running the platform has the integrity to stand up and pull the plug. How are things at your tower?" "It is a different building now," Evelyn replied, a soft, thoughtful smile playing on her lips. "The executive parking signs are gone. I spent yesterday morning sitting on the analyst floor just listening to the junior teams talk. I realized I had built an empire of glass, but I had completely forgotten about the people who lay the foundation. I'm learning to move differently." Julian watched her, his gaze holding a deep, quiet respect that meant more to Evelyn than any award or professional accolade she had ever received. He reached out, his large, rough hand brushing against hers on the wooden surface of the workbench. The touch was brief, but it possessed a lingering, electrifying warmth that promised a completely different future for both of them. A future built on safety, truth, and genuine connection. "You're doing just fine, Evelyn," Julian murmured, his voice incredibly soft. Maya looked up from her plate, her face covered in a small smudge of melted cheese as she looked between her father and the elegant woman who had stepped into their world. "Are you going to come back next Saturday too, Evelyn?" she asked. her voice filled with a beautiful, hopeful innocence. Evelyn looked at the little girl, then up at the single father who had stood steady when her entire universe was crashing down. She reached out, gently wiping the smudge of cheese from Maya's cheek, her eyes reflecting the bright, unclouded future ahead. "I am Maya," Evelyn said, her voice steady and full of absolute certainty. "I am definitely coming back next Saturday." The single father and the executive sat together in the sunlit workshop, the distance between their two worlds completely vanishing in the quiet warmth of the morning. For 14 years, Evelyn had believed that real value was measured in billions of dollars and soaring glass towers. But as she looked at the man beside her, she finally understood the ultimate truth of the architecture. Real power, real intelligence, and real character rarely sit where it is easiest to see. Sometimes, the person you overlook is the only one left who can teach you how to truly live.